Welcome, everyone. My name is John Arthos. I am at Indiana University, Bloomington in Indiana, and I teach in an English department, and I'm also the director of the public speaking course at Indiana. I'm going to offer a few words to frame this session before we get going. So when Paul Ricoeur wrote that the political existence of human beings is, and I'm quoting here, watched over with and guided by violence, he was wrestling with the terrible paradox of power, that nation states assert the right to annex territory and claim sovereignty, to compel obedience and render punishment, so that their very legitimacy is founded on a bed of state violence. But it feels now, though, in the current moment, that we're moving into a deeper crisis of political legitimacy, where the very grammar of mainstream discourse is being radically reconfigured, where inhumanity, cruelty, and hatred are the accepted norms of establishment force, and where tribal animosity is the path to political viability, and where old prejudices are reasserting themselves with a vengeance, and the planet's collapsing under the mindless waste of diminishing resources and a lack of will to meet the enormity of the crisis. The systemic structure of police violence against marginalized communities, having seized the national consciousness for a minute, seems to be reconstituting itself under a kind of generalized complacency again, while mass shootings now have become a mundane event in our country, at least, and school shootings now occur monthly, at least. And prominent politicians are, in the current president's own words recently, all but calling for mass violence and rioting in the streets. Across the ocean, of course, civilian populations are being displaced or sent to filtration camps, and the right to self-determination is being challenged, as we see. So the question that I'm posing to us today for the roundtable is, what, if anything, can we as educators do in the face of these surging forces? What pedagogical, philosophical, communal resources we have to resist this accelerating descent? How do we support our high school teachers and our librarians who are increasingly on the embattled front lines of these culture wars? What's the nature of the duty we have as educators to oppose this rising tide of violence and war, and the progressive dissolution of our social bonds, as it seems? So this wonderful group of folks here that we have at this, our first roundtable of the season, is going to tackle these questions from a variety of perspectives, from inside and outside the academy. We're going to start by going around the table with short statements from each of the participants, and then we'll have a general discussion in which all of you can take part. So I recommend that if you have a burning question, one thing you can do is type it up in the chat. We'll do the best we can to curate questions to make it an interesting and rounded discussion. What I think I'll do is introduce each of our speakers as they speak, rather than try to introduce everybody at once. I think that's going to make the most sense. And I think, if it's okay, we'll go according to the order that we have people listed on the website. And that would mean that Stephanie HinRL will say something to us first. So Stephanie teaches at Fordham, and she's a former president of the Society for Recursive Studies. So let me get up my Zoom here. I'm still in my PowerPoint mode. Stephanie, can you wave your hand so I can see you? There you go. And I'm going to mute myself, and you can say a few words to us.
Okay. Thank you, John, first for the invitation, and it's nice to see everyone and meet new people. I'm going to frame this in relationship to teaching, and I did draw and recur because now that I am moving my status there, I'm going to start hopefully writing a little bit more with his work. So I currently teach 2 classes at Fordham this semester: Faith and Critical Reason and Scripture and Trauma. In both classes, towards the second half of the semester, students probe current crises, including racism, environmental racism, climate change, and different types of incidences of mass trauma, gang violence in El Salvador, sexual violence against women, and the war in Ukraine, just to name a couple. One class entailed a discussion between a friend in Russia working incidentally on Russian political propaganda prior to World War II, which she said was eerily familiar to the propaganda circulating by Putin now. And she dialogued with another friend of ours who teaches public history, who's now relocated in Poland. She is Ukrainian. 2 postures emerge for students when we confront these topics, at least 2, hopelessness and helplessness. They have come up most stridently related to climate change and the crisis in the Ukraine. The former leave students wondering and skeptical about their futures, and the latter baffled that the world is powerless in the face of militants presented by Putin. I articulate 2 points for thought that we might address on this panel and discussion, which reflect my own experience and thinking around how to establish pedagogy that helps students work through hopelessness and helplessness. First, record brackets a conflict between interpretation conceived as the unmasking, demystification, or reduction of illusions to interpretation conceived as the recollection or restoration of meaning and hope. The failure to interpret, to recollect and restore meaning thus leads to a lack of hope. So I wonder in what ways, as educators, we can facilitate interpretation of texts, of symbols. For me, I ask this in the face of growing rejection of religious texts and classics. How can we foster a kind of re-interest in that, or a value, find value in that? Second, in Eileen Brennan's keynote from the 2020 annual conference, some things that she brought up continue to reverberate for me. She explores Ricoeur's early political philosophy and his criticism of the psychology of empiricism, these are her words, which gravitate around pleasure and pain, comfort and happiness, and in doing so fails to deal with the irascibility and the will for domination, as well as the death instincts, and especially the capacity for destruction. So to what end does directing students to look inward to see their own capacity for destruction inherent in a conception of the death driver Thanatos assist in addressing helplessness? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mulatto, I see you're on board now, and I wonder if I can go to you next. We're just trying to take the order that we have people up on the webpage. So Mulatto Ivanovich teaches philosophy at Northern Michigan University. And among the things that he thinks deeply about are issues of forceful displacement and migration. So Mulatto, if your audio is working, can you say a few words to us by way of introduction?
So hello everyone. I hope you can hear me. I ended up in Chicago and I completely did the times wrong because it's 1 hour behind the CT, so I apologize for that. Okay, so I'm just going to start and say a few things that I really found relevant for the overall topic of this roundtable. And as John mentioned, like my work is primarily dealing with humanitarianism, and more prominently with the issues of forceful displacement. As a refugee myself, like that was always kind of playing a very prominent role, and kind of drawing certain parallels between what was going on in former Yugoslavia and what's going on in kind of Eastern Europe will probably kind of set up the framework where certain things can be actually addressed. My classes always kind of deal with these issues, and I
Has Mulatto dropped off? Has his audio dropped off? I see his screen is frozen.
Yeah, it seems that he's frozen.
Okay, so what we can do then is we can, unless he jumps right back on in the course of my, can you talk, Mulatto?
yeah, I think my hotel internet spiked me out. What was the last thing that you could hear?
I was following the freeze, so if someone could remind us.
Your own experience, Mulatto, as a refugee.
Okay, Eastern Europe. So basically, like the target of the classroom and how I see myself as an educator is basically to not only articulate and identify issues that exist elsewhere, because that's very easy, and that's what Eurocentric views did like for centuries. Rather, like to kind of invoke certain responsibilities that we have, not only educators but also students in the classroom. So because the Ukraine and Russia conflict seems to be something that comes at the forefront of like public attention and academic attention in recent months. One thing that I really kind of want to caution, especially my students, is the way how the humanitarian pendulum shifts, like whom we humanize and whom we dehumanize. So in terms of forceful displacement, you could see examples where like the refugees who are white, who are European, who are Christian, quite easily kind of reach the safe havens of the civilized Europe, while the people who are displaced from other locations are encountering violence, violence that under international law is actually a crime. And that security forces of most European countries who are members of European Union are like doing on a day-to-day basis, regardless if we talk about Croatia, Hungary, Poland, and so on and so on. I know that very well because last summer I was working with a local NGO from Serbia who is operating at the Croatian, Serbian, and Croatian-Bosnian border, and the things that I saw and heard, it's just despicable. Another thing is that kind of I really think it's important to understand is that when we talk about conflict and violence, we always talk about an epistemological problem, like how we know what's really going on, what is violence, who is the perpetrator, who is the victim, and usually like how the Western media operates historically is that we immediately have a side that is dehumanized and side that is kind of trying, or at least in attempt to be humanized more, than what kind of blurs the threshold of what violence actually is, and blurs the notion of a victim. And sadly, going back to the ongoing conflict at our doorsteps, at least us who are from Europe, like the victims are usually innocent people on both sides. I have friends both in Kiev and Moscow, and the way how the Western media is delegating this and representing is simply at least epistemologically very problematic, because it creates instances of violence against people who are not really responsible for the conflict that is taking place, and so on. So that's how much from me at this point, and thank you for having me again.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Mulatto. Nima, I see you made it here. Can you speak so I can hear your audio?
Yes, hello. Let me say hello everyone. Thank you. I'm a little bit late. Yes, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, and what I missed, you introduced me already or not?
Yeah, let me just say, Nima is a scholar at large, currently in Montreal, and having escaped political persecution in his own country. And I believe, Nima, you have you're going to read something that you've written for us.
Yes, yes. Thank you. I got started as a newcomer into English-speaking countries. You must be too kind to be patient because I'm not very fluent in English. But I published on my Facebook a long text. After that, I fled from my own home country when I was in Turkey yet. And it is a long text, but I made it short to read for you about my personal experience in solitary confinement that I think has some indications for our topic right now here. On 20 February 2021, which means less than 2 years ago, I woke up sooner than ever, hearing that someone was ringing the doorbell. I had no idea who were behind the door. They were security officers of so-called Islamic Revolutionary Guards, truly labeled as a terrorist organization by Federal State of America. They are actually a big cartel with gun, an armed organization having a fanatic religious ideology with worldwide terrorist missions. Qasem Soleimani was one of their generals. Dr. Artis, you know a little bit about my story. After that, I opened the door. I found myself in solitary confinement as a so-called pre-trial detention for 4 weeks, 28 days, I mean. Considering the limited time we have, let me leave the details of the story and tell what is relevant to our topics here, hermeneutics in real life and at the time of war. I can go on, but do you prefer me to stop right now? It is enough.
Yeah, no, keep going. This is wonderful, Nima.
Okay. When all of a sudden you lose your regular everyday life, it takes time to recognize the new situation. Seems like taking a psychedelic drug. You would be shocked, and cognitive parameters of your mind drastically change, and it will take some hours to remember yourself, your personal identity, personal ego. And remembering your personal ego normally requires some kind of reconsidering, which may lead to a better picture of yourself. Inside the cell, it takes for me at least 3 days to start asking myself, where is here, where am I? Who are these guys behind the cell door? Did I commit really bad things? Have I not been just a writer who was supposed to be a professor in philosophy in my own home country? In solitary confinement, you have too much time to think about everything. I was practicing yoga, which was a great help. And you have a yoga position. You tie your hands from behind and try to pull your upper body downward while sitting, and your nose goes forward as much as possible. I wondered, didn't you do the same? Yes, you did this, putting your nose into people's business. Are you not the one who took the political discourse seriously more than the others take it? People cry in taxis, in streets everywhere when walking, giving some negative comments about the state, but they are living out of this jail with actually no problem. Being a little bit angry, showing lack of satisfaction is an integral part of the regular life. part of their normal gesture, maybe. There is no obliteration of any so-called ordinary referential function of language in recourse terminology, because there is no discourse at all in the strict sense of the word. Therefore, no poetics too. That's why they can speak about politics with no real output. You did too much, I was wondering. You produced critical content for more than 10 years, not only towards their political life, but their lifestyle. They may not be so angry they look. I've not been a member, let me mention, I've not been a member of any political party, never ever. Not even an employed writer or editor in any big or small journal. I've been just an independent writer who wrote under his own real name, plus my photo beside my texts. These officers could not be proud of themselves because of arresting me in my own apartment in Tehran. How can I be a threat? By producing rather philosophically complicated texts against national security, referring to Harold Laswell, for example, in describing the concept of garrison state, or explaining, for example, Freudian viewpoint of revolution. Could it really be a threat against national security or a violation against regular order of people's life? For years, I was receiving comments that you wrote tough, difficult to understand what you say. Apparently, these officers managed to understand me and recognize me as a danger. What about people then? How many of them even have heard the news of my arrest? Was it really a news, my detention? And how many of them will decide to move to do something for me? Who will solace my old mother? And who will be my brother and sister in such a catastrophic situation? I didn't condemn myself because of my passion towards language. Man shall not live with bread alone, but with words. But my words may not bring any light to others, but to myself with these everlasting LEDs inside my cell. Do you prefer cell to continue, Dr. Artis?
Nima, do you have a few more words or would you like to wait?
Yes, a few words, okay. I knew nothing of what was happening outside of the jail till the end of 4th week, when the chief officer in my case come to say last words at 28th night before my freedom on bail. According to his duty, his job, he was supposed to spread a paranoid atmosphere between people, to interrupt the course of people's mutual understanding, and to publish fake news against activists in order to prevent them from being people, from being united. Agents of this part of this organization are supposed to spread violation without any shot and before any shooting. And they do this by graying the words and creating false stories. However, he was not in the interrogation room. The agent, I mean, he was not in the interrogation room to do exactly what he had to do. He told me for the first time after 4 weeks that all the big Persian media abroad published the news. Just 5 or 6 hours after that, you got arrested in your apartment. And some well-known figures and activists reached angrily to your detention, and Kimia, your girlfriend, or any name you put upon this kind of relationship, didn't leave your mother alone. She was the one who followed your file in the court very bravely, where nobody stands for nobody. You won't, he told me, forget her. And let me tell you that he was right. He had earned a PhD regarding my subjective and objective life, and he knew me well. But I showed a stern face, trying to hide the huge emotional waves behind my face, trying not to cry in front of them. That night, I came to know the power of language once again, and to endorse the magical potentiality of contributing to a discourse. What I confessed during solitary confinement didn't need actually to be confessed. Because as a writer, I had nothing to hide. As a writer, I just wanted to be understood by people and wanted to share what social life revealed to me. What they confessed in front of me at 28th night, however, was a great secret. That by means of language, you can even challenge the ethical world of fanatical people and can impress even your enemy. The light of language can pass over the walls, even if they are as tall as a prison's walls. That's why this experience means a lot to me. It dispelled my doubt in the potentialities of language and made a dramatic moment in my personal life. Thank you. This is the short version of my story in solitary confinement, and I'm ready to continue with you experts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nima. By the way, Nima, if you would like, if you can, put your Facebook link in the chat in case people would like to go and read this entry. I think that would be wonderful, if you like.
Yes, I would like, certainly, but this is in Persian, and you have no option but to make use of Google Translator that we cannot address in the...
Okay, all right. Well, but thank you for this. This has been wonderful. So let me then turn to Jennifer. Jennifer is the next person that I have on the page. Jennifer Gaffney is a philosopher at Loyola University Chicago, where she thinks deeply about both democratic practice and right-wing populism, among other things. So Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. This seems like a really wonderful group, and the topic is really important. So I'm going to talk about a figure who falls a little bit outside of hermeneutics, Hannah Arendt. So I hope that's okay and acceptable for everyone, but I think she can shed some light on some of these topics. So we tend to associate totalitarianism with a form of government, often fascism and sometimes communism. We then treat liberalism as the other of totalitarianism. 20th century political philosopher Hannah Arendt thinks differently about this. She treats totalitarianism as the closure of the political sphere, a closure that is possible in any society, including our own liberal democratic society. For Arendt, this closure is no small matter. She attributes extraordinary significance to the political sphere, conceiving of it not in terms of government bureaucracy, as we often do, but instead as a space of appearance, or at that space in which we become visible to one another in the fullness of our humanity. In contrast to the spheres of labor and work, Arendt argues that the political is where we go to speak and act with others in order to introduce something new to the world, to change the course of things, and to intervene in the necessity that governs other spheres of life. Only here do we appear not as dispensable and interchangeable entities, but as radically unique and capable of acting against the overwhelming odds of statistical law and probability. Only in this space do the reductive metrics of utility lose their relevance, disclosing a more authentic possibility for human life, one that enables a common world constituted by the irreducible singularity and plurality of its actors to appear. And yet, as important as this space is, Arendt argues that the very structures that organize liberal democracies today have led to its closure. We know this experience well. While these structures have given rise to networks of technology and commerce, that make us more interconnected and accessible to one another than ever before, we nevertheless remain strikingly hidden from each other, particularly in the context of politics. Citizens in liberal and allegedly open societies struggle not just to converse, but even to see themselves as belonging to the same reality. While we have greater access to each other and to the events of the world than ever before, we use this access to build echo chambers rather than spaces for genuine discourse, and find that we can barely recognize the humanity of those who threaten our own worldview. Arendt, for her part, believes that this distinctive experience of modern life is symptomatic of the closure of the political. She names this experience loneliness and suggests that it can have especially dangerous consequences. Arendt says, quote, "What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience, has become the everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century." In Arendt's view, the loss of the political sphere has produced a world of lonely, atomized individuals who have lost the ability to see themselves and others in their humanity, and who no longer trust in the reality of the surrounding world. Unable to recognize themselves or the world, lonely individuals become desperate, willing to surrender to even the most delusional and totalizing fellowships to recover some semblance of belonging and a ground to stand on. I'd like to suggest that before we can even begin to approach such issues as climate change, Putin's war in Ukraine, January 6th, the global pandemic, mass shootings, systemic racism, all of that, we as teachers must combat the loneliness that seems to be pervasive in our own times. Our students have grown up in a post-truth era in which fake news and alternative facts are referred to regularly to express suspicion over the reliability, not just of the words and deeds of others, but of the reality of the world itself. They have only witnessed politics taking shape in the echo chambers of Twitter and Facebook, and have rarely, if ever, seen a political conversation about a matter of pressing and shared concern end in anything but disaster and division. Our pedagogical challenge, therefore, seems to consist not first in teaching our students about these crises. After all, they need only glance at their smartphones to recognize the state of their world. Rather, it consists in cultivating an environment where they can appear before each other, not simply in their agreement, but also in their disagreement. It consists in cultivating an environment in which they learn how to say what they think while remaining open to having their minds changed by those whose views do not align with their own. It consists in teaching them how to make one another visible rather than perpetuating the hiddenness that our world has normalized. Perhaps above all, it consists in helping them develop the courage to appear before their political opponents, to speak and act with them for the sake of taking shared responsibility for the world they have inherited. This last one is essential for the rehabilitation of the public sphere because, as Arendt reminds us, quote, "It requires courage to leave the protective security of our four walls and enter into the public realm." Courage liberates human beings from their worry about their individual lives for the freedom of the world. Courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. And I think that at least in the United States and maybe sort of the Western liberal world more generally, cultivating this sense of courage in our students, where that has to do with taking responsibility for the world and helping us become visible to each other. I think that's a pretty urgent pedagogical task that we have. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks very much. Last but not least, on our panel today is Timo Hellenius. Hey, Timo, can you give me an audio test? If you're
Okay.
able?
Do I
Oh,
get
that's nice and
okay.
clear. That's
Very
nice.
good then.
Okay, so Timo is a docent in philosophy at the University of Turku in Finland, and he's a longtime member of the Recur Society. Timo, would you like to share a few words with us?
Right, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. And I'm just, I went through the name list or the list of participants and many familiar names there. Good to see you all. But now, as there is really now hermeneutics in real life, I was literally just dropped off back home. And I prepared some notes, and John knows about this because I was sailing. So there was need to take a sailing boat from one place to another. And it took a bit of organizing, but we kind of changed crew midway, and I was brought back home. So I'm now able to attend. But since I prepared the notes just for the case I wouldn't have had this opportunity, John, what do you think? Is it better for me just to very briefly say something freely here, or then go through the notes that I prepared?
It's really your preference, Timo. I kind of enjoy listening to you. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, well, in that case, I might just go and read the notes that I had prepared. But I would have to warn you, but this is not so much academic as this is more like a personal anecdote or a personal recollection of something that I found of value in terms of the title that we have. And so in that perspective and in that way, so let me just begin. Okay, there we go. So I should begin these remarks by mentioning that I won't be so much focusing on hermeneutics, but on explaining some aspects of our collective experience here in Finland. I should likewise readily admit right at the beginning that I have personally never been directly affected by war. Violence, yes, both physical and psychological, but I have never personally experienced war firsthand, as it has conventionally been understood. And for now, I'm living aside the so-called hybrid operations of warfare that I suppose we all have been affected by during the past few years, in form at least of various disinformation campaigns via Facebook and so forth, in social media in particular. But anyway, there is more than one side to the impression you may have already acquired from these initial acknowledgements or opening statements that I made. And I now try to explain a bit more why this whole problem of violence of war actually is wholeheartedly ingrained in all of my understanding of what it means to be a Finn. So first, I have spent a year completing my national duty in the military. That's the Finnish Defense Forces. I was sent to the Reserve Officer School. I have received refresher training on several occasions, so that as a result, I have for some time now held the rank of First Lieutenant. And this was not based on my free personal choice, however. According to the Constitution of Finland, every Finnish citizen is obligated to participate in national defense. Even more so, every male Finnish citizen aged from 18 to 60 is liable for military service. Women can apply and do it on a voluntary basis. The only option to choose from is to apply to the so-called civil service, whose purpose is to give training for unarmed civilian tasks relating to large-scale crisis management. But this training lasts longer, though, and it's therefore not so very familiar and popular. So people usually tend to choose the military service. So the theory of war and the thought of an armed conflict is, for this reason, not completely unfamiliar to me. Quite the contrary, actually, as Finland has not been and still is not a member of any military alliance, we have made preparations to defend our territory on our own. But yes, for those who know, we have submitted our application for NATO membership, but it has not yet been ratified by all NATO states or members. So we are not yet officially full members. The widely shared understanding has been that Finnish conscription well meets the requirements of the security environment and generates sufficient resources for the Army, Navy, and Air Force to act effectively in a crisis or war. And this now leads me to my second point. Even though this one is more collective and universal in nature, I continue with a personal anecdote relating to my grandfather. He was born in 1918, slightly over 100 years ago. And at the age of 21, he was, along with practically all able male Finns who could be decently armed, commanded to join the defense forces and to subsequently face an overwhelming offending opponent from the east that had begun a military campaign against Finland. The hardened forces were successful in their defense, and even though Finland had to cede about 10% of its territory via the Moscow Peace Treaty, the Soviet Union was prevented from annexing Finland. That means that we remained independent. The point I want to make is not success, but the trauma caused by the extended military campaign known as a whole as the Second World War. In Finland, it is still not wholly uncustomary for someone to allude to the miracle of winter war or the spirit of winter war, that in its essence actually means the willingness to sacrifice one's individual freedoms for the sake of potentially maintaining collective freedom. According to estimates, almost 26,000 people died or went missing, and over 43,000 people were wounded on the Finnish side during the 105-day winter war. That was the beginning of the Second World War for us here in Finland. And now the personal anecdote. The single and the absolutely only time I heard my dear grandfather to use a swear word was when he, hoping that I would be sheltered from ever being in a similar situation, he was at my age then. So he explained himself by simply stating in one phrase, and I quote him directly here, what the bloody fucking hell the war was. This was the only time I heard him to use words like that. What the bloody fucking hell the war was. Moreover, I knew him as a devoted family man, widely respected because of his character, who by external circumstances had to do whatever was necessary and compulsory. Even though he survived, the war completely altered the course of his life as well as his self-understanding. He never got to study forestry as he would have wished. Instead, once all campaigns were over, he had to take what was offered to him. He became a career officer in the Finnish Defense Forces. Even though his career, externally speaking, was extremely successful, the sheer fact of him having had that career instead of something else speaks of an extended trauma that was and still is collective in nature. I hope it is clear that it was, of course, not only my grandfather who had to face life-altering horrors of the involuntary, but that several generations of Finns were directly traumatized in years from 1939 to 1945, from newborn babies to elderly people. This collective traumatic experience has defined our nation. It has become a major part of our nation's narrative that has taken both explicit forms, such as certain classical movies that are regularly reshoot and shown on TV, especially during our Independence Day, and more subtle structural forms, such as the model of conscription I also have experienced, or some, should I call them, givens relating to our geopolitical location. So as I began by stating that I have personally never been directly affected by war, I should complement this by saying that I have been affected by war regardless. Here I could bring in Ricker's thoughts on the narrative formation of collective identities that facilitate identity formation at the level of individuals. His discussion on recognition relating both to the struggle for recognition and the cultural history of conflicts, to use Ricker's terms in the cause of recognition. His notion of the war of hermeneutics within itself, or the conflict of interpretations, as seen, for example, between the hugely different stories told at the other side of the border regarding the alleged aggressors. Or perhaps even some aspects of Ricker's discussion of Freud, I mean the struggle between the two tribes of Eros and Thanatos. I recall Stephanie alluded to Thanatos already. Or even Hegel, I mean the arduous detour of self-consciousness or the conflict embedded in Bildung. And now I use that as a bridge to move over to the question of education. So very last words for about that. So moreover, The discussion could be brought to the level of le noyau éthico-mythique, tied in with Ricker's observant thesis that in the execution of the creative variations spanning from such nucleus, meaning the ethico-mythical nucleus of cultures, Ricker states something like this: l'humanité est irréductiblement plurale, meaning that the whole of humanity, the idea of humanity, is irreducibly plural due to la singularité historique de chaque groupe humain. So the historical singularity of each human group results in the idea, or rather the observation, that the whole of humanity is irreducibly plural. Following from this analysis, one could say that the task of an educator is, for these reasons, to nevertheless remind that regardless of its iteration, the polis, in whichever historical, temporal, geopolitical, linguistic situation it is, and even more so the idea of humanity, is fundamentally perishable unless sustained by the accepting will to live together that is enacted each day. So those were the prepared remarks that I had put together, and I believe that it's now perhaps time for more general discussion. Thanks.
Yes, thanks very, very much, Timo. And thank you all. Thank you all to the participants of the roundtable. I think, you know, this was so moving to me. So there's been this remarkable mixture of the personal and political in this. I think everyone will agree, just a remarkable richness in that, in the relationships that we're drawing between our own personal experiences and these issues that we're facing in a broader way. So what we want to do, I think, is now move to a general discussion in which we're not going to make a distinction between the roundtable participants and everyone else who's here. Everybody is now a member of the roundtable. And I probably will not be very good at curating and at calling calling people's names. So we'll just have to see what works best here. I do want to say that we can see lots of themes and cross themes that are already developing in what has already been said. For example, you know, this theme of the collective that Timo ended with, and then Jennifer's talk of the lonely atomized individual. And so there are these really interesting relationships that are already developing. So the roundtable participants who've already spoken should feel free to ask each other questions as well. But anybody should speak up. I know that you guys are going to have many questions about things that people have said or things that people haven't said. So please get us started. I see Brad already has a question. Brad, rather than reading it, could you give us, if your audio is good, could you give us the oral version of that?
I can try, but for some reason I've managed to block myself out, my picture out, so I'm talking disembodiedly. Can you hear me?
We can see you and we can hear you very clearly.
Oh, good, because I cannot see myself. Now, my thought going in and listening to people is in the context of how Ricoeur speaks about history and the importance of the hermeneutics of history. How do we tell our stories and who tells them? Recently, I read an article by a constitutional scholar who talked about the US Constitution as being a slaveocracy. I'd never heard that term before, but it explains a lot in terms of the ongoing insidious racism in our culture, but maybe also the the observations that were made by Mulatto about how people of color have a more difficult time emigrating and being accepted as valid immigrants. And this happens because of climate change and all that kind of stuff. The other part is that there's a New York Times celebrated book called Castes, the origin of our discontents, or something like that. And the woman who writes that very insightful book talks about how the caste structure in the United States is similar to that in India, and also was the basis for the Nazification of Germany just before World War II. So my question is, how do we teach, how do we so teach history and maybe philosophy and maybe spirituality, a la Stephanie, in such a way that we address the first naivete of the students who come before us, provide a critical moment, and then also bring them to a second naivete that is, or might restore hope, but hope even more so might empower them to take on a lifetime of social critique and activism.
Brad, thank you for that wonderful question. So would anybody like to engage Brad or try to answer his question in any way, or ask him a question yourself? And this can be anybody on the roundtable or in the original roundtable, or anyone.
Yeah, I'd like to speak on behalf of my colleagues in Indonesia. I come from Indonesia. They just call me Sur. I'm a high school teacher. I think the journey from the first naivete and to the second naivete is quite long, okay? And I can cover it in 1 semester or 2 semesters, or even 2 years of teaching or 3 years of teaching. Because I think what I try to do is to start with my students from their naive experience about what's going on in the world and things like that, and they're quite articulate, even though they are not the first English speaker, but they quite articulate to represent their thought in metaphors, a kind of metaphors, various metaphors about what life is, what's going on in this world, what war is, and things like that. And that's the start. That's the start. I think metaphor is the start for my high school students in my experience. And then after that, you have to go through to the narrative structure. Again, we see the metaphorical process in the, was that what Ricker said, Ricker called as catharsis. They have to know themselves again, and it's a long journey for the teenagers in their age to know themselves, to understand their narrative story, their life narratives, their own life's narratives, and to see themselves from the other point of view, to get the catharsis or to facilitate the catharsis. And then after that, you have to go through the structure of slaveocracy, injustice in this world, and so on, which might be covered by the other teachers who teach the other subject, like history and so on. But I think it's a long journey, in my opinion. I saw so many familiar names here. I read most of the time I read Ricker in the translation by David Peleur. Sorry if I mispronounce your name, but I learned so much from. I get blessing, and Ricker is quite famous here in Indonesia among the Christians and some Muslims, okay, and study of their Holy Bible and Holy Quran. So that's all what I can say as a teacher. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Could I jump in and ask you a question, a follow-up question? Because you said that your students have a sort of a natural understanding of metaphor. They speak with and through metaphor. So do you see in them an ability to connect metaphor and narrative, or narrative and metaphor? Because of course Ricoeur calls, metaphor as a narrative in miniature. So do you have to help them move between the two? What is that relationship for them in their understanding of these things?
Well, yeah, I need to facilitate, to help them to go through the journey from the metaphor and to the metaphorical process in the life narrative. I usually, what I did last year is I usually use the reformational structure, Doyowardian structure. If anyone happens to be familiar with Doyoward, I learned from the Institute of Christian Studies in Canada. So the reformational structure provide the philosophy of the reality, structure of reality. I use that as the the reciprocal interaction with the metaphor itself. So the Doyowardian structure of reality provide the scientific structure, which is quite familiar with my students. And at the same time, the reference to the reality, which comes from Doyowardian, the understanding of reformational structure, will be articulated in the expression of their metaphors. So the metaphors expression is quite, for the Indonesian, is quite common here. We are we have a kind of language which uses the euphemism. We don't talk something literally. Usually, we are quite Asian. We talk in proverbs and things like that. Okay, figurative language is more powerful here and it's more common than. Yeah, there is positive and negative, but it's quite familiar with us, including metaphors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Dan, I see you have a question here on trauma, and but perhaps you could say that. I think you were addressing Stephanie in that as well. Could you give us that question?
Okay, just briefly, I think virtually everyone has talked about trauma, and there's much discussion of the legacy of trauma, as Timo brought out quite a bit. And I was thinking of Stephanie probing deeply into the dynamics of trauma. Is trauma actually usually an impediment to hermeneutics in the sense of understanding, with the idea of verstehen in hermeneutics usually involving empathy of some sort? And does trauma impede empathy?
I'm going to have to say first, Nima, I really appreciated what you shared, and I'm deeply affected by it right now. So I'm going to try to formulate my responses. I should just say, well, I have a personal history that you tapped into in your story. And so I'm deeply moved by what you said. And I think I'm going to answer your question exactly, Dan, which is that I'm finding it difficult to find words because of the articulation in Nima's expression of this, of being rendered helpless and losing a complete sense of identity in one moment, where grasping language becomes critical, and also almost one is indisposed to the capacity to speak when under when experiencing such intense levels, which can be called traumatic. So I think that in my question, implicit in the question that I asked, related to turning to text, has to do with trying to facilitate, after an experience of helplessness, access to language. Because having accessibility to language and imagination creates a pathway for trying to not only create meaning from the event, but also for reimagining, like a restructuring of the self, of a restructuring of reality, of knowing that there can be some kind of stability in reality after the event of being rendered completely helpless. So for sure, trauma, being in the trauma and not having integrated a trauma. So whether it's so recent or whether it's 30 years later, if the experience itself hasn't been integrated, which means if the past event hasn't been negotiated enough so that it's no longer capable of infiltrating the present, language and imagination become very inaccessible. So that's one thing. I'd like to just also throw out, I'm really, Jennifer, what you said just struck me in terms of thinking about an order of an experience. So I'll throw in an example and then also say, I've done quite a bit of work on shame, which itself, Nima, is evident in the experience of being physically captured, so that one's own basic caretaking of the body becomes undermined, and that is really a shame, humiliating experience, so that it facilitates shame. A different example, and then just to tie into this concept of loneliness, it's actually a question. So I worked at the 9/11 Memorial Museum for 2 years during the Trump election. And what was a pretty docile environment in terms of mourning and grief quickly became, with his laws about, I can't remember the terms, the travel bans, right? And the anti-Islamic rhetoric was very apparent in the museum, and there were a few episodes that could have turned quickly into violence without security there, of rhetoric. Two little girls that came in on a school trip that were wearing veils, who were chastised and then removed their veils, which the teacher told us never had happened before. Things like that were just very apparent in the museum space. And I just don't know where I tie violence like that into a non-negotiation or self-reflexivity, and then also to some deep shame that gets projected. I'm trying to figure out where I would fit a lack of mourning or like past loss into that, or where loneliness fits into that discourse. Is it an after effect or is it before? I don't know. I find that so worth thinking about. We can't answer it here, but it's very interesting to me. So Dan, I hope I answered your question, and thank you, Nima, very much.
Yes. So Stephanie mentioned several names, and so if anyone would like, I think Jennifer, definitely, I think it would be great if you would respond to Stephanie, but also Dan, if you had a follow-up, and Nima, if you'd like to jump in, but anyone should jump in at this point.
May I add something?
Please.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your attention. And let me add something. This kind of people, this so-called Islamic Revolution Guards people, I mean, they have normally a very restricted sexual life because of their religious education. For example, it is illegal for them to have girlfriend, and they cannot put positive value on having girlfriend and making love with girls before marriage. And then my Persian tongue readers can understand what happened exactly. He came to me in solitary confinement and told me that this girl helped you, and you won't forget her. This is a part of my text that is very dramatic for Persian tongue language. And let me say you that I was receiving comments from so many people. I didn't know them. And all of them telling me that it was very shocking, and we shed tears before we get at the end of your text. Thank you, Stephanie, and everybody to pay attention to my story. And that was, I like to add it.
Thank you, Nima. David, did you want to get in on this thread of the conversation?
I want to get in. Excuse me. I think my question has to go to you, John, although it's directed to all the people who are teaching, which I'm not doing anymore. I'm improvising how to put it together here. One of the fundamental polarities in Ricoeur's thought is between violence and discourse. And in a way, there's a kind of optimism there that we can avoid violence if we would talk to one another. But I wonder, in the current world, if we can't say more about that with the distinction between discourse and rhetoric. When I see comments on the little social media I look at or reading the newspapers, I don't see discourse, I see rhetoric. And the political discourse at the moment is very much politics of labeling things without having to explain what that label means, simply by getting the term down, often negative, you've dealt with the problem. So I guess what I'm interested here in terms of thinking being back in a classroom again, it's the problem of how do we get people to enter into discourse?
You know, I see, David, I see that Jason, who is a graduate student at my institution and who teaches the public speaking course that I created there, might want to engage that question. And Suze is also here, another one of my grad students who's also currently teaching in that course, because I think we try to get at that there. But Jason has taught the entire course a couple of times. And I'm thinking, Jason, in terms of David's question of discourse, as particular our transformative speech assignment, right, where we actually have students looking at their own discourse.
Yeah. Well, what that immediately brings to mind is speeches that transformational speeches that I've noted were more effective for me personally. And that course is based in invitational rhetoric. So we slowly build up towards establishing our commonalities, inviting people to consider a different space, and then in the end, everybody is transformed through degrees of adherence closer to an understanding. And so I think, and I continue to grapple with this in my own dissertation project, in my civic engagement, and that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of question, how do we invite people to consider that they have skin in the game, right? And so speeches that I find effective from just the undergraduate level ask people to consider, to say, you're involved in this. Even if you are not homeless, you are still affected by people experiencing homelessness, or Even though we're in Indiana, we're still affected by the fires in California. And so I think for me, it's that kind of tie as neither just easily connected, easily related, but as something that has to be gradually untangled. And so I think effective discourse starts to untangle the ways things are inextricably bound.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So David, I'll just add to that, because we may be using the word discourse differently, right? But what the fourth speech of the course tries to do is to get students to be reflexive about their own rhetoric, right? So that they analyze the commonplaces that are used in a debate, in a public debate, in a public controversy. And so in their fourth speech, they're actually looking at their own language. So that's how we try to sort of pierce that that barrier, right, between ideological intransigence and sovereignty by this moment of reflexivity. So I don't know if that gets at all at what you were talking about, David, in terms of the relationship between discourse and rhetoric. However, I will say that that's very, I mean, I really did build that course out of hermeneutics, out of a hermeneutic sensibility. So perhaps that might help a little bit. And I'm seeing David Ulster, could you have a question here? You bring up Jennifer's issue of loneliness. Could you talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, it was kind of more of just an observation than a statement. I guess one thing I think Jennifer began her talk with saying that she wasn't really addressing it from the standpoint of hermeneutics, but I'm going to actually have to disagree with you, Jennifer. I think that you are in that teaching is really, I hadn't thought about it this way before, but it's really a hermeneutic task because of what we're shaping and forming our own students, getting them to respond to us and to think. And also, back to what David Plower said too about political discourse isn't really discourse, it's rhetoric, and I would add probably poor rhetoric at that. The challenge that presents to teaching, because saw a poll the other day that I'm in Texas, North Texas, 77% of all Texas teachers K-12 want to quit. They want to walk out. They don't like to get shot at. They don't like to be yelled at school board meetings by uninformed people about what they're teaching and whatnot. So they're just ready to give up. And I posted this, and somebody responded, said, well, I guess they're just free to walk out if they want to, without considering whether or not they had a reason, to walk out. So it's really, at least here in Texas and other places, and even on the college level, it's almost traumatic. I wonder, also not for teachers, because, what you say can get you in a good deal of trouble. You're the very thing that you're trying to do as a teacher is the very thing you're being told not to do. So I don't have an answer for that, but in some way, there's probably a little bit of loneliness and hopelessness on both sides of that teaching and with our students. So it really is a challenge. But the last thing I'll say is another thing that I think Jennifer said about really giving our students the courage to speak what is on their mind without fear, and at the same time being willing to have their mind changed. And that's true discourse. Yeah, I believe the violence, what David said about recur. Yes, if we could have discourse, we could not have violence. At least that's the hope. It's not a guarantee. Sometimes poor discourse could lead to violence as well. So it's just there's not anything to plug in and make work. It's just a constant hermeneutic task to raise the conversation. So and thanks to all the speakers. This is a tremendous panel.
Thanks, David. Hey, Jennifer, your name has been invoked several times now. Would you like to speak?
Sure. I've been trying to just, step back, but yeah. So David, I really appreciate what you said. I think you're right that at least my reading of Arendt is pretty hermeneutic. And I think you're right to point out the loneliness, not just generally, and not just with the students, but also with the teachers, particularly at the K through 12 level. Like the demands on them are almost impossible, particularly in politically complex environments like Texas. I think when it comes to I think you're right. Like if we were to take Arendt and develop her ideas in the context of teaching, I think she would suggest that our task is to shift. It's to kind of create opportunities to challenge the pre-given frameworks that our students are living in, particularly the lonely framework, where they don't even believe in the possibility of talking to each other. I mean, that's one of the things that's been so striking to me about my students. When I give them a chance to engage in a debate and try to talk with them about how to do that in a civil way, they come out of it and they're like, I didn't even know we could do that. That's crazy. Like, this is a whole new world. So, and I think that especially, the belief that that's not even a possibility, that's probably one of the most terrifying things to me, but also the thing I think we need to challenge most as teachers. When it comes to discourse, it does seem like, so Arendt has this really nice idea about interest. So she thinks that in sort of neoliberal society, we have come to think of interest totally in terms of self-interest, private self-interest. But really the word itself has a relational dimension, like interest. And that really speaks to the fact that like interests go between people and politics go between people, and that in between is so important. So I think when it's just rhetoric, there's nothing in between. There's no real matter of shared concern. And I feel like getting students to talk depends on finding what that in between is for them, so that they have something to talk about. So yeah, I know, Stephanie, you asked that great question about loneliness and the 9/11 memorial and the Trump administration and the anti-immigrant sort of, I think I understood the question, sorry, I'm just gonna address all the questions. I hope that's okay. It sounded like you were saying like we couldn't quite tell where loneliness fit into that. Like, does it come before, does it come after? I think that Arendt at least would say that it comes long before the way that we dealt with 9/11 and the way that we've since kind of had this hostility toward immigrants and toward people who don't look American enough. But I think that she would argue that like the political sphere where we could cultivate a different sensibility about that died long ago. And so we should have expected that that's exactly how 9/11 would be remembered, because we haven't worked hard enough to hold open that space of appearance. And I think in using the term loneliness, I think this is kind of the photographic negative of what she calls statelessness. But I think she just wants to remind us that like none of us, no matter how awesome we think we are, we're not, like, we're all kind of in this lonely position, and we're all vulnerable to behaving that way. And we all have to kind of work at resisting that. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Jennifer. So there's a sort of a sub-thread that's developed at the end of our chats around the theme of trauma. So Zuz and Tom and Dan and Michael have all weighed in on that question. And because we're heading towards the end of our session here, if one of you or more than one of you would like to maybe say a word to ask that question again about, because clearly trauma has been a theme that's touched us today. So could one of you speak up about that?
I'm going to briefly just go back to the question about empathy and that I didn't address. And I agree with what Dan wrote. The one thing I will say is that, yes, the shame experience of trauma acts as an inhibitor to empathy. And in fact, the shame, the logic of shame, the rationale around shame can find its exact opposite in structures the same parallels in empathy, so that they do act as inhibitors. The other thing I'll put in that discourse is that trauma signifies, the responses to trauma are characterized by extremes in either direction. So you will often see overemphasizing related to people and the work around it. It's almost as if trying to overcome in the opposite direction. So I can't think of what creates that distinction off the top of my head right now, but just to offer that you can get both. More has been written on trauma as blocking empathy.
Okay, and following up on that, Tom, I see you had a question, and you spoke, you and Dan sort of spoke with each other about the issue of trauma, and your question had to do with the resolution of trauma. Did you want to speak to that?
May I say something?
Please.
Yeah. I can't say anything actually about the trauma healing in the school system or in my classroom, because in Indonesia, I believe that based on my experience as a teacher for more than 20 years, the school system is the source of the prominent trauma in our own students. The education system, the whole education system, as what Pierre Bourdieu had described, the habitus is the source of the trauma for the students. So I don't know whether teaching or trying to engage them about trauma healing in a classroom would be like throwing a pail of water to the ocean of trauma. But yeah, that's the reality. Thank you. That's all.
Yeah. Suze, did you want to follow up?
Oh, no, thank you. I think that's
No, Suze, I have another grad student who spoke about trauma, and I'm not sure if I'm checking to see if she's still here. We're running down if there's, oh, there you go, Suze.
Well, it's just been on my mind a lot lately, the way that trauma manifests very clearly in my P155 course as it relates to actually the political divide between my students. So I have a student that is very, the discourse that the student uses is it leans toward the alt-right. I don't know for sure, but perhaps, maybe. And then I have some very liberal students on the other side of the spectrum for whom the discourse that this student uses is traumatizing them. And yet with the blogs that we have embedded in the course, this student that's in question, who has been sort of alienated by his classmates, you know, he's expressing that he just wants to get away from all this hate in the world. And so he's experiencing loneliness. And it's like, I wonder if, I don't know how, but I wonder how I might be able to move my class as a community toward a shared understanding that, you know, I think at this point in time, they're viewing each other as monsters for the beliefs that they have, and that can't fly. It's at the end of the semester, I am so hoping that we can all come to like shared empathy for each other, but it's I guess all I'm trying to say is that I'm looking for reflective assignments maybe not assignments, but conversations that, how do I lead this conversation? If you have any advice, that would be really wonderful.
So thank you for that wonderful question, that moving question, Suze. And it's so sort of indicative of all of the issues that we brought up today. And I see, Anna, you have a question at the end. Is this a question, Anna, that you could, oh, by the way, people should feel free to direct answers to Suze or to keep that conversation going with her, because that I don't want to leave that unanswered. And you could sort of funnel them through me, through HNR, through this organization, if you wanted to keep up that conversation with her. Anna, did you want to close us out?
Thank you, John. I think the question that I've left, it would need some time for the discussions. So I totally understand that we're close to the end, but maybe just a thought. So it's been on my mind for a while, because as some of you may know, I'm also personally affected by the world events that are happening across the ocean. So I'm just wondering how today we philosophers, educators, researchers may rethink and maybe redescribe the language of global education, and if we have the need to do that. Because as we see, as we can observe today, so it's been shifting a lot from the language of globalization, transparent borders, internationalization. We were so used to all these definitions, and today we're seeing that national borders, the questions of security, they gain and regain their importance again. And there's a lot of political division that affects the portrait of global education today. Are we in need of new theories? Do we need a new language? How we can reshift thinking towards a new global education today?
Thank you so much for that, Anna. Let me make two comments in closing. The first is that Ernst Wolf, who's the editor of the Recur journal, the Études Recuriennes, has asked if there is interest in a special issue on education and hermeneutics. So if anybody has an interest, please let me know, and I will have that. I will let him know. It seems like a lot is going on here that would be productive to continue having a conversation about. The second thing I will say is that, because I see Robert has a wonderful comment at the end here, this is a little trick in Zoom. If you will go down to the right bottom corner of your screen, there are 3 dots. And if you click on those dots, the very first option there is to save the chat, because otherwise the chat disappears. So if you'd like to go over some of these comments, because they've been so rich, and if you'd like to contact the people that spoke, we can try to be, the organization can try to be a conduit for that. So with that, I see we're at 3:31. And so I do have to bring this conversation to a close, and thank you all so much for this wonderful beginning of the season.